The year is 1845, and the United States is a country that doesn't quite believe in itself yet. It stretches from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Missouri River, and then nothing. Beyond that line, 2,000 miles of wilderness, mountain, and desert that no American government had ever truly crossed. But on the other side of that wilderness sat California, and in 1848, someone found gold there. Not just a little gold, enough gold to change the entire direction of a nation. Suddenly, 100,000 people were trying to get from the East Coast to California, and there was no easy way to do it. You could sail around the tip of South America, a 6-month journey that killed a shocking number of people. You could cross through Panama, where the jungle fever would take you before the gold ever could. Or you could take a wagon west. 6 brutal months through plains, mountains, and desert, burying your friends along the trail. None of these options were good. And in Washington, a man named Asa Whitney had already been shouting about the solution for years. Whitney was a merchant, a dreamer, and honestly kind of obsessed. He had traveled to China in the 1840s, and on that long, lonely voyage, a single idea had seized him completely: a railroad. One iron railroad stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He petitioned Congress about it in 1845. They smiled, nodded, and did absolutely nothing. Because here's the problem nobody wanted to say out loud. The country wasn't just physically divided by 2,000 miles of wilderness. It was being torn apart by something far more dangerous: the question of slavery. Every new territory, every new state, every new inch of land the country acquired ripped that wound open again. The North wanted free states, the South wanted slave states, and a transcontinental railroad meant someone had to decide where it would go, north or south. That single question, which route, turned a simple engineering project into a political grenade. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri pushed for a central route through his home state. Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War under President Pierce, wanted a southern route through Texas and New Mexico. He even sent out survey teams, the Pacific Railroad surveys of 1853, to prove his route was best. They mapped 4 possible routes across the continent, and every single route report just made the argument louder. Meanwhile, the country itself was cracking. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act tore apart the old Missouri Compromise and let new territories vote on slavery themselves. Kansas erupted into a miniature civil war, pro-slavery settlers against free soil settlers, burning each other's towns. A congressman named Preston Brooks walked onto the Senate floor and beat Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with a metal cane. That's the level of rage running through the country in these years. And somehow, in the middle of all this fury, people were still talking about a railroad. Because here's what the dreamers understood, that the politicians couldn't see past their anger long enough to grasp. A railroad wouldn't just connect 2 coastlines, it would bind the country together in a way that nothing else could. Iron rails don't care about state lines, iron rails don't care about north or south, they just move. But before any of that could happen, one more catastrophe had to come first. In November of 1860, a tall lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, and 7 states left the Union before he even took the oath. The dream of a transcontinental railroad should have died right there, buried under 4 years of the bloodiest war Americans had ever seen. Instead, somehow, it was about to be born. Theodore Judah was not a patient man. He was 30 years old, wiry, intense, and absolutely convinced he knew something nobody else would believe. The year was 1856, and the country was already splitting at the seams over slavery. But Judah wasn't thinking about politics. He was thinking about mountains. Specifically, he was thinking about how to punch a railroad straight through the Sierra Nevada, something every serious engineer in America had called impossible. Here's the thing about Theodore Judah. He had already built a railroad through difficult terrain before, up in New York, so he knew what impossible actually looked like. And the Sierra Nevada, he believed, was not impossible. It just needed the right man to find the right pass. So in the summer of 1860, Judah hired a doctor, a local physician in Dutch Flat, California, named Daniel Strong, who told him about a ridge. A long, gradual ridge that ran all the way up from the foothills to the crest of the Sierra. Nobody had seriously surveyed it for railroad purposes. Judah and Strong rode out into the mountains together that fall, taking measurements, scribbling notes, calculating grades. What Judah found was a slope gentle enough, barely, for a locomotive to climb. It ran through a place called Donner Pass. Yes, that Donner Pass. The same killing ground where a stranded wagon party had resorted to cannibalism just 14 years before. History has a dark sense of humor. Judah rode back down the mountains, sat in a small room above a hardware store in Sacramento, and wrote a pamphlet. He called it A Practical Plan for Building the Pacific Railroad. Then he went to San Francisco and tried to sell the idea to wealthy businessmen. He got laughed out of every meeting. They called him Crazy Judah. He didn't care. He went back to Sacramento, and this time he found 4 men who were willing to listen. Their names were Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They were not railroad men. Stanford sold groceries, Huntington and Hopkins ran a hardware store, Crocker sold dry goods, but they were rich, they were ambitious, and they were hungry for something bigger. Judah spread his maps on a table above that hardware store, a room they would later call the Pacific Railroad Convention, and he made his case. He showed them the route, the grades, the projected costs. He showed them what was possible. The 4 men looked at each other. They agreed to fund the survey, officially, formally, for $1,500 each. That meeting, in a room above a hardware store, was the moment the Central Pacific Railroad was born. But Judah still needed one more thing: the United States government. He needed Congress to pass a law, to grant land, to issue bonds, to make the dream legally and financially real. Judah packed his maps and boarded a ship headed for Washington, D.C. He walked the halls of Congress like a man who had nothing to lose. He set up what historians would later describe as a one-man railroad lobby. He handed out documents, cornered senators, showed his maps to anyone who would stand still long enough to look. And he found one critical ally, a congressman from Iowa named Grenville Dodge, a trained engineer who had already surveyed the Missouri River Valley for a railroad route. Dodge had seen the West. He knew what Judah was talking about. He started pushing the legislation forward. Back home, the Civil War had just exploded. President Lincoln, desperate to hold the nation together and connect California to the Union, was paying close attention. And suddenly, what had seemed like one obsessed engineer's fantasy was starting to look like a matter of national survival. The money was real, the route was real, the law was coming. Theodore Judah had done the impossible part. He had made people believe. But the men who would actually drive the iron into the ground were a very different kind of dangerous. Sacramento, California, January 8, 1863. The ground was frozen, the sky was gray, and a crowd of about 1,000 people stood in the mud, waiting for something to happen. Theodore Judah was supposed to be there. He had dreamed this moment into existence. But the man holding the shovel that day was Leland Stanford, governor of California, one of the Big Four, and a man who had never built a single mile of railroad in his life. Stanford lifted a silver shovel, said a few words, and broke the earth. The crowd cheered, and just like that, the Central Pacific Railroad was officially underway. Except it wasn't really. See, breaking ground is one thing. Actually building a railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains is something else entirely. The Central Pacic's first challenge wasn't money, or politics, or engineering, it was workers. California in 1863 was still riding the tail end of the gold rush era. Every white laborer they hired quit within days. The pay was decent, about $3 a day, but the work was brutal, the hours were endless, and there was always a rumor of gold somewhere else. By the summer of 1864, construction superintendent Charles Crocker was desperate. He had miles of track to lay and almost no one to lay it. Then someone made a suggestion: hire the Chinese. Crocker resisted at first. He thought they were too small, too thin, not strong enough for the kind of work this required. But his superintendent James Strobridge tried a crew of 50 Chinese men anyway, almost as an experiment. Within a week, Strobridge went back to Crocker and said, "Give me 1,000 more." These men, most of them from Guangdong province in southern China, were extraordinary. They worked in precise, coordinated teams. They were disciplined, careful, and fast. They didn't drink on the job. They boiled their drinking water and drank tea instead, which, without anyone fully understanding why, kept them healthier than the other crews. By 1865, nearly 10,000 Chinese men were working for the Central Pacific. They made up about 80% of the entire workforce, and they were paid less than their white counterparts, about $26 a month, with no housing or food provided. The injustice was real, and it was deliberate. But here's the thing, they did the work anyway, and they did it better than anyone else on the line. Now the track was moving. By late 1865, the Central Pacific had pushed about 50 miles east of Sacramento. 50 miles doesn't sound like much, but those first 50 miles were the easy part. Ahead of them rose the Sierra Nevada, a wall of granite 2 miles high, with no passes, no roads, and winter temperatures that could kill a man in hours. The railroad had to go over it. Chief Engineer Samuel Montague looked at the maps and shook his head. The grades were too steep for conventional track laying. They would have to blast through solid granite, millions of tons of it, using black powder and hand drills, inch by inch. Chinese workers were lowered down cliff faces in wicker baskets, drilling holes by hand into sheer rock. They packed in the black powder, they lit the fuse, and then they pulled on the ropes as fast as they could. Some made it back up in time, some didn't. The mountain was taking lives, and the railroad had barely even reached the base of it. But as hard as the Sierra Nevada was, the other end of the line was about to face something far more dangerous. The year was 1866, and America had a railroad to build, fast. 2 companies had been handed the job, and neither one planned to share the glory. The Union Pacific would push west from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would push east from Sacramento, California. They would meet somewhere in the middle, but nobody had agreed on exactly where. That vagueness was intentional, because Congress had made a deal that turned every mile of track into money. For every mile of track laid, each company received a strip of government land along the route. In the flatlands, that was around 6,400 acres per mile. Through the mountains, it jumped to 12,800 acres per mile. So the further you built, the richer you got. And if there was no finish line, you just kept building and kept collecting. This was not just construction. This was a land grab dressed up as a national project. Now the 2 companies could not have been more different. The Union Pacific had the easier terrain, flat, open prairie stretching across Nebraska and Wyoming. But it had almost no workers. The Civil War had just ended, and the men who might have signed up were scattered, exhausted, or dead. So the Union Pacific turned to the one group nobody else wanted to hire. Irish immigrants, tens of thousands of them, fresh off the boats, broke and willing. Many had fought in the war themselves. They were tough, organized, and they knew how to follow orders under pressure. At its peak, the Union Pacific fielded over 10,000 men. They moved like an army, because in many ways they were one. Their boss in the field was a former Civil War general named Grenville Dodge. Dodge had spent years surveying the West before the war, and he knew the land like a soldier knows a battlefield. He ran his crews with military discipline, sunrise to sunset, no excuses. Meanwhile, out west, the Central Pacific had a different problem entirely. The terrain was brutal, granite mountains, 1,000-foot drops, snowfields in July. But they also had a workforce that would quietly become the most remarkable story of the whole railroad. Charles Crocker, the Central Pacific's construction boss, had taken a gamble in 1865 that most people laughed at. He had hired Chinese laborers, most of them recent immigrants from Guangdong province in southern China. Other bosses said they were too small, too frail for this kind of work. Crocker disagreed. He pointed out that the men who built the Great Wall of China were Chinese. Nobody laughed after that. By 1866, the Central Pacific employed around 10,000 Chinese workers. They drilled into granite by hand, lowered themselves down cliff faces in wicker baskets, and packed black powder into cracks in the rock. When the powder blew, they hauled the rubble out by hand, bucketful by bucketful. They worked in the snow, through avalanches, in temperatures cold enough to kill. Some of them were buried by those avalanches and not found until the spring thaw. They were paid $26 a month, less than the white workers beside them, doing the same job. They asked for equal pay in 1867. Crocker cut off their food supply until they went back to work. They went back. They had no choice, And yet, they kept building. They kept pushing east, foot by foot, through rock that engineers had called impossible. By the summer of 1866, both crews had found their rhythm. The Union Pacific was chewing through Nebraska at a mile a day, sometimes two. The Central Pacific had finally crested the Sierra Nevada and was rolling into the Nevada desert. Two forces, one from the east, one from the west, grinding toward each other across a continent. And somewhere out in the middle, a meeting point still had no name. But soon, the race would turn brutal, and the two companies would start building parallel tracks just to steal each other's land. They called it the Sierra Nevada, the snowy mountain range in Spanish. And in the winter of 1865, it lived up to every syllable of that name. The Central Pacific had been crawling east from Sacramento for 2 years, and now it hit a wall, not metaphorical, but literal granite. Charles Crocker, the big, red-faced superintendent who ran Central Pacific's construction crew, stood at the base of that wall and made a decision that would become legend. He hired Chinese immigrants, thousands of them, at a time when most of white California didn't even consider them fully human. By the spring of 1865, there were roughly 7,000 Chinese men driving spikes, hauling timber, and drilling into rock faces that had never felt a human hand. They came mostly from Guangdong province, having crossed the Pacific on crowded ships with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a willingness to work. Crocker paid them $26 a month, less than the white workers who made $35 and got their meals covered on top of it. And yet the Chinese crews outpaced every other gang on the line. They woke before dawn, cooked their own rice and vegetables, drank boiled tea instead of the river water that gave other men dysentery, and they were already swinging hammers by the time the sun cracked the ridge. Here's the thing nobody tells you about blasting through granite. Black powder, the explosive they were using, has a maddening flaw. You drill a hole into the rock, pack it with powder, light the fuse, and run. But half the time the fuse misfires, and some poor man has to walk back to that hole and figure out whether it's going to explode in his face or not. Men died doing exactly that. No headlines, no monuments, just a name scratched off a payroll ledger and a letter that never made it back to Guangdong. Then a foreman named James Strobridge, hard-edged, one-eyed from an earlier blasting accident, watched the Chinese workers weave baskets. Not decorative baskets, working baskets, the kind you could lower a man into. The idea hit Strobridge like a second blast. Lower the workers in those baskets over the cliff face, let them drill and place the charges, then haul them up before the explosion. It was so simple it was almost insane, and it worked almost every time. Cape Horn, a sheer granite promontory above the American River with a 900-foot drop, fell to this method in the spring of 1866. The Chinese workers dangled in baskets over that void, chipping and drilling, and they cut a ledge into the mountain that the Iron Horse could follow. But Cape Horn was warm-up compared to what came next. The Summit Tunnel, Tunnel number 6, sat at 7,000 feet elevation, right through the hardest granite in the entire Sierra Nevada. Crocker attacked it from both ends and drove a third shaft down from the top, creating 4 working faces simultaneously. In the dead of winter, a blizzard buried the entire work camp under 40 feet of snow. 40 feet. The men kept working, underground in the tunnel itself, because it was actually warmer there than on the surface. They moved through the mountain, while the mountain buried everything above them. Crocker brought in a new weapon that winter, nitroglycerin. It was faster than black powder, yes, but it was also wildly, unpredictably lethal. It could detonate from heat, from shock, from what felt like a bad look in its direction. Strobridge hated it, but the math was simple. Black powder moved the rock 8 inches a day, nitroglycerin moved it nearly 2 feet. So they used it, and they buried more men, and they kept going. By the summer of 1867, after 15 brutal months, they punched through the Summit Tunnel. 1,659 feet of hand-drilled granite, paid for in sweat and blood and lives that history forgot to count. The Sierra Nevada was behind them now, the desert ahead. And out on the flat plains of Nebraska, Union Pacific had been having a very different kind of war. But the men laying those tracks were about to face something that no mountain had ever prepared anyone for. The summer of 1866 brought something nobody was ready for. Not the heat, not the altitude, the rock. The Central Pacific had hit the Sierra Nevada granite, and it was like trying to cut through iron with a butter knife. Charles Crocker, the man running the labor crews, stood at the base of that wall and said almost nothing. He just looked at it, then walked away. That silence meant something was about to change. His Chinese workers, over 10,000 of them by now, had already proven themselves stronger and more disciplined than anyone had expected. They worked in organized gangs, they cooked their own food, they boiled their drinking water while the white workers got sick, drinking straight from streams. But now the mountain was asking for something more than muscle. It was asking for chemistry. The standard method was black powder. You drilled a hole, packed it with powder, lit the fuse, ran. Slow, dangerous, and on granite this hard, barely effective. So Crocker's engineers turned to something newer, something terrifying: nitroglycerin. It had only been synthesized about 20 years before, and people were still learning, the hard way, what it could do. One wrong move, one bump too hard, one shift in temperature, and it detonated without warning. In 1866 alone, a nitroglycerin explosion killed workers at a Wells Fargo office in San Francisco, just from transporting the stuff. The state of California briefly banned it entirely. But the Central Pacific needed to move, and they needed to move fast. So they made their own, on-site in the mountains, mixing the compound fresh each morning. The Chinese workers learned to hand drill holes into the rock face, lower themselves in wicker baskets over sheer cliffs, pack the nitroglycerin in, and then, if they were fast enough, haul themselves back up before the whole face blew. Some of them weren't fast enough. There are no exact numbers. The Central Pacific kept no reliable records of Chinese worker deaths. Their names were not recorded. Their deaths were not counted in any official report. Historians today estimate that somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Chinese workers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. That number may be conservative. And it wasn't just explosions. Snow came in 40-foot drifts that swallowed entire camps whole. Workers dug tunnels through the snow just to reach the tunnels they were digging through the rock. They lived underground for months. Avalanches hit without warning. In the spring thaw, when the snow finally pulled back, crews found bodies still gripping their tools, frozen exactly where they had fallen. Still, they kept going. By the summer of 1867, they had blasted and hand-carved 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. The summit tunnel alone, a quarter-mile through solid granite, took over a year. Workers chipped away from both ends and a middle shaft, advancing sometimes less than a foot per day. A foot a day. Think about that for a moment. On the other side of the country, the Union Pacific was racing across the Great Plains, flat, open ground, laying miles of track every single day. The race was deeply unequal, and everyone knew it. But the Central Pacific kept moving, because Crocker told them he would replace any crew that slowed down. And the workers, who were sending money home to families in Guangdong province, could not afford to stop. There was no union to protect them, no law to guarantee their safety. Nothing but the mountain in front of them, and the deadline behind them. And just when it seemed like the hardest part was finally over, just when they could see the other side, the desert began. By the spring of 1868, both companies knew the finish line was close, and neither one planned to stop. The Central Pacific had blasted through the Sierra Nevada, and now they were rolling fast across the Nevada desert. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, had torn through Nebraska and was pushing hard into Wyoming. Two iron giants racing toward each other, except nobody had told them where to meet. That detail, where exactly they would connect, had never been officially decided, and that ambiguity turned a construction project into something that looked a whole lot like war. Here's what most people don't know. Both companies got paid by the mile. The more track you laid, the more federal bonds you collected. So stopping early wasn't just losing a race, it was leaving money on the table. Leland Stanford and his partners at the Central Pacific understood this perfectly. Thomas Durant at the Union Pacific understood it even better. Durant was not a man who believed in limits, moral, physical, or financial. He had already been funneling money through a shell company called Credit Mobilier, skimming millions in construction contracts. But that scandal was still hidden, for now. What everyone could see, in the spring of 1868, was the track. miles and miles of gleaming iron rail, stretching further every single week. The Central Pacific's secret weapon was still its Chinese workforce. By this point, roughly 10,000 Chinese men were driving the Western Line forward. They had survived the Sierra Nevada. They had survived nitroglycerin. Now they were crossing the Nevada and Utah deserts in brutal summer heat. The Union Pacific had its own force. Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, formerly enslaved men, all working in brutal conditions on the Eastern Line. Both crews lived in rolling tent cities that moved with the tracks. These weren't just work camps. They were wild, lawless places. Towns like Julesburg, Colorado, and Laramie, Wyoming exploded overnight. Saloons, gambling dens, and worse, all chasing the workers' wages. Newspapers called them Hell on Wheels, and the name stuck. Meanwhile, the Lakota and Cheyenne were watching all of this from the hills. The railroad was cutting directly through their hunting grounds, their sacred lands, their entire way of life. Attacks on survey crews and work gangs became more frequent. The U.S. Army, under General William Tecumseh Sherman, was deployed to protect the lines. Sherman saw the railroad as a weapon, a way to destroy the buffalo herds the Plains tribes depended on. He wrote it plainly in letters: kill the buffalo, and you kill the way of life. It was a strategy of deliberate destruction, and the railroad was its engine. But on the ground, the workers didn't think about grand strategy. They thought about the next mile of track. By the fall of 1868, the pace had become almost unbelievable. The Union Pacific was laying up to 4 miles of track per day. The Central Pacific fired back, 3 miles, then 4, then pushing toward 5. It wasn't construction anymore. It was a sprint. Then came the moment that turned a race into a legend. Charles Crocker, the man running construction for the Central Pacific, made a bet. He wagered $10,000, real money, enormous money, that his crews could lay 10 miles of track in a single day. Thomas Durant took the bet, confident it was impossible. On April 28, 1869, Crocker's crews went to work before sunrise. They worked in perfectly choreographed shifts, rails lifted, spikes driven, bolts tightened, next rail already moving into place. By the end of the day, they had laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track. Durant never paid the bet, but the record stood, and it still stands today, never broken in the history of American railroading. 2 lines were now only miles apart, close enough that survey teams could actually see each other across the salt flats of Utah. The race was almost over, but the 2 companies couldn't agree on where to stop, so for weeks they didn't. Their grading crews ran parallel lines, sometimes just yards apart, ignoring each other like rivals at a starting line. The government finally had to step in and name the spot, a small, unremarkable place in the Utah Territory, a place called Promontory Summit. And what happened there on May 10, 1869? You already know the image. But what you don't know is what was really going on behind the smiles in that photograph. Promontory Summit, Utah, May 10, 1869. 2 locomotives sat face to face on the same track, separated by just a few feet of empty rail. One belonged to the Central Pacific, pushing east from California. The other to the Union Pacific, pushing west from Nebraska. They had been racing toward each other for years, and now finally, the gap was almost closed. A crowd of roughly 600 people had gathered in the Utah desert to watch history happen. Workers, reporters, dignitaries, gamblers, all standing in the dust under an open sky. Telegraph lines had been strung all the way to the site. The whole country was waiting on the other end. Leland Stanford, governor of California and president of the Central Pacific, was there in a top hat and a tailored coat. Thomas Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, stood on the other side, haggard, distracted, and nursing a headache from the wildest night of his life. Just the day before, a group of unpaid workers had literally kidnapped his private train car and held him hostage until the company paid their wages. Durant had spent the night negotiating his own release. He showed up to the most important ceremony of his career, barely having slept. That is the kind of chaos that built this railroad. Now the final rail was laid into place. 2 rails of polished iron, gleaming in the May sun, and then came the spike. It was made of 17.6 karat gold, about 6 inches long, inscribed with words on all 4 sides. One side read, "The Pacific Railroad, ground broken January 8, 1863. Another side read, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." It was a prayer disguised as a railroad spike. Stanford raised the ceremonial silver maul, a hammer, over the last tie. The telegraph operator at the site held his key open, ready to send a single signal the moment the spike was driven home. Across the country, cities had rigged bells and cannons to fire the instant that signal came through. In San Francisco, a 220-pound ball of iron was suspended above the waterfront, ready to drop. In Chicago, a parade was already forming in the streets. In Washington, the Capitol building itself had been wired to ring a bell. Stanford swung the hammer. He missed, completely whiffed it. The crowd fell quiet for just a moment. Durant stepped up and swung next. He missed too. Two of the most powerful men in American railroad history could not hit a nail. An actual railroad worker stepped in and finished the job. But here's the thing. The telegraph operator didn't wait. The moment the spike touched the rail, he sent the signal anyway. One word, tapped out in Morse code across the entire country. Done. Just 4 letters. In San Francisco, that iron ball dropped into the bay. In Chicago, the parade erupted. In Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell rang for the first time in years. In New York, 100 guns fired a salute in City Hall Park. The whole country lit up at the same moment, connected by a single signal, a single word. Done. The 2 locomotives crept forward until their cowcatchers touched. A symbolic kiss of iron and steam. Someone popped a bottle of champagne. Photographs were taken, hands were shaken, speeches were made. And then, almost as quickly as it had gathered, the crowd dispersed. The workers drifted away. The dignitaries boarded their private cars. The golden spike was pulled back out of the ground almost immediately. It was too valuable to leave in the dirt. A regular iron spike was hammered in its place. Nobody photographed that part. And so the most famous nail in American history spent less than an hour in the ground. But what it represented could never be undone. A continent finally stitched together, coast to coast, in one unbroken line of iron. What had once taken 6 months by wagon now took 6 days by train. America would never be the same. But for thousands of the men who built it, the hardest part was still just beginning. The golden spike was barely cold when the transformation began. Within a year, the railroad was carrying 3,000 passengers a week across a continent that once took months to cross. Towns that had taken decades to build now sprouted in weeks along the tracks. Omaha doubled in size almost overnight. Chicago became the beating heart of the entire American economy, a hub where cattle, grain, and steel all converged. The price of shipping goods across the country dropped by 90%. A barrel of flour that once cost a fortune to move from Ohio to California now traveled for almost nothing. For millions of ordinary Americans, the railroad was the great equalizer, a machine that made the country feel, for the first time, truly connected. Families who had never dreamed of owning land suddenly packed their bags and headed west. Between 1870 and 1880, the population of Kansas alone grew by nearly 200%. The railroad companies handed out pamphlets in a dozen languages: English, German, Swedish, Norwegian, promising rich black soil and a fresh start. Thousands of European immigrants stepped off boats in New York and stepped onto trains heading west before they had even learned a single word of English. It was the American dream, mass-produced and delivered by locomotive. But here's what the pamphlets never mentioned. The land those families were being sold, most of it was not empty. It had people on it. The railroad did not just carry passengers west. It carried the United States Army. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the same man who had burned a path through Georgia, now turned his attention to the Plains tribes. Sherman said it plainly: the railroads were the key to breaking native resistance. He wrote in his own letters that the destruction of the buffalo herds was the fastest way to destroy the Plains Indians' way of life. And so it happened, with terrifying speed. In 1870, an estimated 8 million bison still roamed the Great Plains. By 1883, fewer than 300 remained. Men rode the trains west specifically to shoot them, shooting from the windows for sport, leaving the carcasses to rot in the sun. It was not an accident. It was a policy. Without the buffalo, the Lakota, The Cheyenne, the Comanche, peoples whose entire civilization was built around the herds, had no food, no shelter, no trade. The railroad drove a steel spike straight through the heart of the Great Plains, and the world on either side of that line was never the same. The Red River War of 1874 drove the Comanche onto reservations at gunpoint. The Great Sioux War of 1876 ended with the Lakota stripped of the Black Hills, land they had been guaranteed by treaty. Each war, each forced march, each broken treaty, the railroad made them all possible, made them all faster. The train moved soldiers in days that would have taken weeks on horseback. The speed that thrilled a passenger on his way to San Francisco was the same speed that ended a civilization. And yet even the winners did not always win cleanly. The railroad barons who had built the line, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, were busy turning their government contracts into private empires. The Credit Mobilier scandal broke in 1872, revealing that railroad insiders had stolen tens of millions of dollars meant for construction and had quietly bribed congressmen to look the other way. It was one of the greatest financial frauds in American history up to that point. The railroad had promised to knit the country together, and it had, but it had also exposed every crack in the nation's foundation. The greed, the violence, the promises kept only for some. The golden spike at Promontory Summit now sat in a museum case, and out on the plains, the wind blew across a landscape that would never look the same again. The railroad had built a nation. It had also made sure that not everyone got to live in it. But the story of what came next, the cities that exploded, the fortunes that were made and stolen, the America that rose from all of it, that story was only just beginning. May 10, 1869, the air smelled like coal smoke and gunpowder, and something nobody had a name for yet. Two locomotives sat face to face on a thin ribbon of iron, stretching across the American continent. One had come from the east, one had come from the west, and in a few moments, they would touch. Leland Stanford raised a silver hammer. He was a governor, a railroad baron, a man who had gotten very rich off the backs of men who would never be invited to this ceremony. He swung, he missed. The crowd didn't care. A telegraph operator tapped a single word to the rest of the nation. Done. And the whole country erupted. Church bells rang in Philadelphia. In Chicago, a parade 7 miles long wound through the streets. In New York, people fired a 100-gun salute at City Hall. For one afternoon, it felt like America had finally kept a promise it had made to itself, a coast-to-coast nation, truly connected for the first time. But what actually changed? Everything. Before the railroad, a journey from New York to San Francisco took 6 months. You sailed around the bottom of South America, through storms that could crack a ship in half, or you crossed Panama on foot, through jungle and disease. After the railroad, that same trip took 6 days. 6 days. The mathematics of American life rewrote itself overnight. Cattle ranchers in Texas could ship beef to New York while it was still worth selling. Farmers in Kansas could send wheat to markets they'd never seen. Miners in Nevada could get supplies in weeks instead of months. The American economy didn't just grow, it accelerated. Towns that sat along the rail line exploded into cities almost overnight. Towns that the railroad bypassed simply died. The railroad didn't follow civilization west, it dragged civilization behind it. And with it came something else entirely: tourism. George Pullman's sleeping cars turned long-distance travel into something almost glamorous. Rich Americans began riding west just to see the buffalo, the canyons, the open sky. They called it the Grand Tour of America. Photographers rode the rails and sent images back east of landscapes nobody had believed were real. The West became mythology, and mythology sold railroad tickets. But here is the part the celebrations left out. The same rails that connected America severed it. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, they had watched the Iron Road come and understood better than anyone what it meant. It meant the buffalo were finished. By 1880, hunters had slaughtered an estimated 30 million bison. 30 million animals, shot from moving trains, left to rot in the sun, stripped for their hides. The Plains tribes had built entire civilizations around the bison: food, shelter, clothing, ceremony. When the herds died, the civilizations that depended on them were meant to die too. That was not an accident. General William Sherman had written it plainly in his letters. kill the buffalo, and you kill the Indian's ability to resist. The railroad was the delivery mechanism for that policy, and it worked, in the most brutal sense of the word. By 1890, the Lakota, once the most powerful nation on the Great Plains, had been confined to reservations a fraction of their former territory. The Transcontinental Railroad did not just connect two coasts, it ended a world, and it built another one on top of the wreckage. That world, built on iron and ambition and enormous human cost, is the one we still live in today. Every highway that follows an old rail corridor, every city that grew because a railroad chose to stop there, every border, every boomtown, every wound that never fully healed. It all traces back to two locomotives facing each other on a Utah hillside and a silver hammer that missed its mark.